Hello, and thank you for joining today's coffee break, part of the SCOMathon brand from this one onwards. So today we're going to be talking about SCOM Security. We're going to be giving you some tricks and tips and showing you some tools and, most importantly, management packs to secure your environment. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself. So my name is Bruce Cullen. I'm the Director of Products at Cookdown and also your host for today. And with me, more importantly, is Nathan Gau. So Nathan Gau has got 20 plus years in the technology industry. He's worked in small and large companies alike, and he currently works at Microsoft. Nathan, you've been there for 6 years, and he's a household name in the SCOM community, having written the security monitoring management pack, which we're going to focus on today, with lots of experience of alerts management. He also is a prolific blogger. If you haven't seen his blog today, no doubt you will find out about it today. So hello, Nathan. Good to have you with us.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Yeah. So without further ado, we'll just dig into SCOM as a security tool and then dig into things with the demo. So SCOM as a security tool, I hear you say. Well, why not? At a really high level, it is really, really good for parsing log data and providing alerts on what it finds from those logs. So it's sort of perfect as a platform for some of these things. It's also great for collecting event data and diagnostic data. If you think about the basic architecture of SCOM, you have management servers and agents. You have agents on everything that you might want to do security monitoring on. And on those machines that you have an agent on, you can do things like discovery, and you can extend what SCOM does through management packs and report on things that are found. And then you have automatic recoveries to take steps on things that are seen. SCOM is a really good foundation for security and as a good place to start for a security tool. So that's where I'm going to bring in the security monitoring management pack from Nathan. So I guess, Nathan, tell me a bit about it. What is it? What does it do?
Sure. So this was I don't know how many people are familiar with Microsoft, but we're required to do when we get hired on technical conferences once every 2 years, which is a big event. They call it Tech Ready or Ready. They keep rebranding it, but where they fly you out to Seattle or Vegas, wherever it is they're hosting it, and you spend a week in these just conference with these 1-hour sessions. My first, as a new employee to Microsoft almost 6 years ago now, it was probably about 5 years ago when this happened. You're required to kind of go to this thing as part of your training and development plan. I didn't find any of the SCOM stuff very interesting, so I went to all the cyber courses. So that's kind of how this started. I thought the security stuff was far more interesting, and to be fair, you could kind of see the writing on the wall internally that as an on-premise solution, Microsoft is certainly moving more in that Azure Monitor cloud direction and whatnot. And I know it's sacrilegious, but I just didn't find the cloud to be all that appealing of an option. So I was looking at cyber a little closer. So I was sitting in a course where they were talking about. They were talking about basically some stuff that some of our DART team and your first responders had put together, as they're combing through logs, stuff they were literally finding in logs that no one detected. Example would be like, the bad guy literally launching Mimikatz. It's logged, right? Just the stock off the shelf version of Mimikatz and basically using it to steal credentials and that type of thing. And it's logged, and I'm sitting here going, SCOM's really good at parsing logs. Why aren't we doing something like this? The truth of the matter is people have tried to do it. That's what really surprised me about it is people have tried to do it. And the biggest failure, in my opinion, of those solutions was, one, not knowing what to look for, and two, not understanding the basics of alert management. And that you can't just alert on everything. And I made a lot of mistakes in that area too when I started building it. So this started out just as an example as a console project. And if you go look at my blog history, I wrote a 3-part series on using SCOM to detect pass the hash, where I basically downloaded Mimikatz into my lab. And I performed a pass the hash attack in my lab, and then went through basically started combing through event log data, looking for the events that were generated by my activities, and tried to see if there was something unique enough that that ultimately would be something that I could write into and detect. I ended up writing 3 rules, and ultimately in the current version of security monitoring, only one of those rules is on, because it's the only one that was unique enough that just wasn't generating alerts on what would normally be a benign event. So that was kind of the beginning of it. It started out as a console project. I didn't know how to write management packs at the time, other than to do the standard console authoring or whatnot. But as part of my own growth, I wanted opportunities to stay home more, so I learned VSAE so I could teach the workshop that we offered on VSAE. And eventually that project got moved into VSAE and kind of became what it did. Started out kind of as an intrusion detection thing, but as you're going to see in the slide, that's really a smaller component of it, is kind of come to realize that there's a lot of business practices that we can use this tool to, or best practices, I should say, that we could use this tool to help an organization, kind of give the security teams a perspective into what's going on the operational side of things, as well as some simple checks and balances, right? So, if somebody adds somebody to the domain admins group, it might be a legitimate activity, but it shouldn't happen very often. And obviously, there's got to be a procedure for it, right? So, and if that procedure is not being followed, then we've got a real problem where, from an organizational standpoint. So, starting to kind of create a window into operational practices, some basic detection for intrusion events, and whatnot. Over when SMB, when the WannaCry came out, it suddenly became an option to start detecting legacy protocols, because like we've talked about before, SCOM's great at pulling events, and the reality is most of those events are logged. And so started using it as a means to detect legacy protocols and determine where they're being used, more importantly, right? It doesn't do you good. You say, hey, you've got NTLM version 1 in the environment. But knowing what servers are using NTLM version 1 actually does provide you some benefit, because now you can see what's there, where it's going on, and whatnot. So over time, it evolved into, I started out initially as the example of a mistake I made. I started out initially alerting every time a legacy protocol was used. Well, that's just really bad.
That would fill out
exactly. You end up with thousands of
quickly,
alerts. It doesn't work. But and so it's like, well, this makes more sense to set it up as a collection rule and a report. And I don't pretend to be really good at writing reports. My SQL is awful, but now I've got some cheap, cheesy reports that you can run that says, hey, I see NTLM1 is being used on these servers. So it really kind of just evolved from there. So I changed the name from intrusion detection to security monitoring when I released it. Matter of fact, the first version didn't even have any reports in it, and it was unsealed. Now, obviously, it's a sealed solution. It's got reports built into it, and whatnot. And I want to say we're working. I've been on a May cadence. Every May, I release a new version. I want to say this May will be the 5th release of the management pack.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. So my key takeaway there is you wrote the security monitoring management pack to work from home more often, and I guess you didn't in the current time. You probably have your
VSAE to do that. Yes, I did a lot of this. I'll be honest with you, I travel a lot. A lot of this was spent with time in hotels. I got nothing better to do in the evenings, so why not kind of play around with some of this stuff?
No, makes sense.
Yeah. So, but now there's a tool out there that it's actually fairly effective, and it picks up some things. I'm not going to pretend like I can detect everything that a bad guy can do. It's certainly not a replacement for ATA or Defender or antivirus or any of that kind of stuff. But it does give you a window into some of the things that these tools don't detect. So consider it a defense in depth strategy. I would like to at some point build some additional features into it that can make it more like ATA, but unfortunately SCOM's somewhat limited in what it allows me to do. So there's all sorts of issues with that. But yes, there's definitely a working from home component to it, because I could teach that workshop once a quarter, and people liked it when you actually pulled your projects into it and showed them what you were working on. It tends
I
to
bet.
actually, when they see that you're actually somebody who does authoring as opposed to some hack that just learned how to teach the course, it's um, but it can be very, very useful. So.
Makes sense. You've touched on some of this already, but let's now dig into the features, I guess, starting with credible threat detection. So, I mean, assuming no kind of prior knowledge, what is that?
So this is stuff that really shouldn't happen. That's kind of how I look at it. So the pass the hash thing that you have in there. All right, I have yet to actually see the one pass the hash events that I have in my environment. I have yet to see that trigger in any lab, any customer test environment, and whatnot. And it's basically when the user swaps credentials in Mimikatz, I can basically pick that up and detect it. Now, there are other things they can do in Mimikatz that I should probably play around with the tool a little bit more just to see how they harvest them and see what I can log from that. But the point being is there's just certain things that you really shouldn't see. And if you see it, that's kind of a warning. Now, there still are false positives in these areas. For instance, as I have recently learned, my golden ticket detection has some false positives in it that I'm currently working on with a customer. And it really has more to do with how they've designed their environment, and it's causing Kerberos tickets to fail in the way a golden ticket would typically fail. And so we're kind of looking at possible options to fix that. But I had another customer, same rule, who does a double reset of their Curb TGT password nightly, which best practice is to do that, I think, every 90 days. And do a single reset every 90 days, which if you did a single reset every 90 days, it would never flag that rule. But when you do a double reset nightly, you're going to have broken Kerberos tickets the next day, and there's just no way around that because you're basically trying to nightly eliminate any potential golden ticket, which I think is overkill in my humble opinion, but that's what they were doing. So, so whatnot. So WMI persistence monitoring, just another thing where you can basically set up, call it a scheduled task that runs within WMI. It's very, very difficult to detect. But it can be logged, and so it's there. And so I went through some, I found some articles on how to do it, did it in my lab, took a look at what was being logged, created a rule that does that. PowerShell, there's lots of actual PowerShell rules in there. So execution policy, if you run an execution policy bypass. Now, to be fair, there's normal reasons to do that. Matter of fact, SCOM is a big contributor to that, right? So I just use SCOM as an example. SCOM runs a lot of PowerShell scripts in the background. If you have a execution policy set to, you have a restricted execution policy, guess what? All of those scripts, because they're not signed, will fail. So SCOM runs all of its internal monitoring through to bypass that. So I actually had to have an exception in there for SCOM. But within your normal environment, there may be a case to run with a bypass execution policy. But bottom line is this is going to tell you someone's doing it. Running PowerShell in a hidden window that no one can see. It's another one where it's going to tell you somebody's doing it. So those types of things that really shouldn't be happening very often. We've got some alerting mechanisms for that. And so I kind of lump all of that under credible threats, because when you start seeing some of that kind of stuff going on, you're kind of looking at it going, why is this going on? Should this be going on? And maybe at the end of your investigation, it should be, but I just, in my experience, those things don't typically show up when you're, when you just drop this into an environment, because people don't normally do that kind of thing.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So
credible threats, essentially things that could happen, under business as usual, but not sort of super likely to happen.
Correct.
So if they happen, you want to basically check, is this thing legit or not?
Right.
Moving on into the next sort of category then, so forwarded events. What's this one?
Okay, so, and this is kind of probably more of a legacy on-prem thing at this point, because a lot of people are forwarding directly into log analytics using the monitoring agent and whatnot. But if you are using Windows Event Collector servers, I have one of the prerequisites that I actually have with the zip file is a discovery management pack for Windows Event Collector servers. It's pretty simple. It just basically checks to see if the service is running and then populates the class. So if you're using event collector servers, now you have these big, massive log aggregation servers, and chances are you're feeding into Splunk or something like that, but we can stick a SCOM agent on those servers and we can monitor events that pop in there. So I basically took most of your credible threat detection And I think that's pretty much all I've done, actually. And anything that kind of fell what I felt was credible threats, I also have targeted. I have those rules targeted against your forwarded events. And so it's basically going to comb those and say you have a desktop environment where somebody's done pass a hash and they swap credentials and whatnot to kind of move around in the environment. I can pick that up as a forwarded event if you're using Windows Event Collector servers and generate alert and let you know what's going on.
That's a really good use case, because obviously you're not likely to have SCOM agents on all of your desktops. Yes, you may be using log analytics, but obviously that is not the cheapest thing to do. If you've already got SCOM, then why not use its capabilities?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you still obviously with event collector servers. I mean, there are limitations to that, and especially in large environments, it's not reasonable. But if you happen to be using event forwarding, this is just an option that you can take advantage of. If not, I mean, the discovery is there. The rules won't run because it won't discover the classes, so it's not that big of a deal. But anything that falls under a forwarded event is effectively a credible threat that is targeted against the Windows Event Collector server, so that you can see what's going on.
Makes perfect sense. Next is our operational events.
Right. So these fall under things that are fairly normal in environment, but still, again, shouldn't be happening very often. So, as an example, creating a local admin that you have on there, right? So I shouldn't be just signing onto a server and making somebody a local admin, except during that build process, right? I mean, that effectively only happens during the build process. At that point, in theory, that shouldn't be happening very often. Adding a member to, say, the domain admins group or the schema admins or the enterprise admins, it's another one of those things that really shouldn't be happening all that often. Those types of things kind of fall under operational events. And the way I look at it is, at the end of the day, you've got, in theory, a security team that is paying attention to this stuff. And they say, hey, I see that Joe User got added to the domain admins group. So, and it'll tell you who added them, right? So this is, oh, Nathan Gau added Bruce Cullen to the domain admins group. So they can call up Nathan Gau and be like, hey, did you add Bruce to the domain admins group? Oh, yeah, I did. Of course, the next question is a proper change control file, or they can verify it via change control or whatever that process looks like, right? To make sure that, I haven't gone rogue. Because I've seen this, especially, and it's not even rogue, it's just lazy. So, what invariably happens is you'll end up with somebody that, oh, well, I don't know what rights they need, so let's just make them a DA. They've got everything they need now, right? So that's how an organization ends up with hundreds or thousands of domain admins and really no control over their environments and no idea of knowing if they've been hacked or not. And we can actually start putting some visibility on those types of activities, so that somebody in the security team can take a look at this and talk to the operational folks and say, yeah, this behavior really needs to stop. Because it shouldn't be happening very often, right?
Makes sense.
And yeah. So
it makes total sense. And like you say, the lazy admin is the most common one that springs to mind there. I don't know what permissions you need. I'm just going to give you domain admin. Happy days, problem solved. Not necessarily the right thing to do. And finally, we have threat hunting.
Yeah, so this has kind of evolved. This used to start, I think there might be a few rules that alert from a threat hunting standpoint, but for the most part, I've moved all of this into reports now. But the idea behind this is to actually detect legacy protocol usage. And I've actually got a report I can run that should give you some data just to kind of see how it works. But cool. and tell you where, basically tell you where it's going on in the environment, so that you now know where you've got, say, something going on that's exploitable, right? All your legacy protocols at the end of the day are going to be exploitable by a bad guy. Now, what I would like to eventually do, and this is more to do with me having the time to figure out how to do it and people willing to help me test it, is start creating alerting when people intentionally try to use a legacy protocol. Because that is something a bad guy will do. So they've compromised your workstation, right? So if you have, for instance, if you don't have TLS, I mean, you may have everything configured to use TLS 1.2, but if it's not enforced, right, they can try to send a request with TLS, say 1.0 or whatever they're trying to do. Usually that's an auditable, trackable event, and the report will just tell you that it's been used and where it's being used. I would ideally like to get to a point where we can generate alerts when somebody's forcing that usage, if that makes sense, making a
It
request
does.
that's on. Unfortunately, that's going to take a lot of groundwork and whatnot to be able to do something like that and actually have it be somewhat non-noisy. But TLS, LAN Manager, NTLM version 1, SMB version 1, NTLM version 1 is actually still in use, but it's definitely recommended to go V2 at this point. But if you're not enforcing it, right, your older systems are going to automatically. Actually, from my SCOM 2019 server is still doing it. You'll see that when you run the report. But when you're not enforcing it, right, it's going to default to that lower protocol. And so, but you can see where it's going on. It gives you an opportunity to start testing it and, verifying in a lab that the applications that you're using aren't breaking, those types of things, so you know where it's going on, right?
Makes sense.
So, yeah.
Cool, no, perfect. Makes perfect sense. I can think of a few examples over my time where I've either been bitten by one of these. The most recent one is so ServiceNow recently switched their defaults from NTLM1, it's not NTLM, sorry, TLS1 to TLS 1.2, and they disabled the ability to use anything less. And we were by default from SCOM sending TLS1, and it was being rejected. It's like, what's going on? Why is nothing working? Which is always fun. I didn't realize it was even a thing in the first place, so that's always fun.
And that's honestly the biggest reason why these protocols don't get turned off, at least in my humble opinion. I've got a very small sample size of experience, but my general observation is people are afraid to turn this kind of stuff off because they're afraid of what might break.
What might break,
exactly. The answer to that question.
Exactly.
So at least giving you an ability to track it down and see where it's being used.
It's super useful in our case.
Which, yeah, exactly. It kind of helps you kind of at least move forward and like, well, I see it's being used here. Now, I will note with some of this kind of stuff, some of this has been hard to test. So, like, I know the NTLM and the SMB reports work great. I don't have Landman and TLS running in my lab, so I had to trust the articles on how those event IDs work. So there is some of that where it's like, well, I hope this works, but I know the reports will work, but it is dependent on what's documented for the actual events themselves, which I've found over the years is not always accurate. So I will caution you on some of that kind of stuff, but like I know NTLM1 and SMB1 work because I've had those run in labs and I've tested it and validated the reports are working and whatnot. But some of the really old things like Landman and Digest or whatnot, I haven't really been able to. I'm basing it based off of what our documentation is for those events, and so
makes sense. Yeah. Well, that's always good. At the end of the day, that's where feedback comes in. I think let's move on to a demo now. Let's see it in action. Let me just make you presenter, give you the powers.
All right. So can you see my screen? You should be looking at Visual Studio at the moment.
I can see Visual Studio.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to switch over to my lab. So I can't. Yes. All right, there you go. So I think I've hidden it. So I want to talk about, really want to highlight some of the newer features with it. What I've generally found in my interaction with people is they're usually running the 1.4 version or really the first one I've sealed out, and I've really added a lot since then. So you can kind of see some of the things that we're doing. So obviously GPO change tracking, and I actually fixed this rule, by the way, for that was also a customer request. All of this information was not populating properly. So in the next revision, this fix will be there. So when you have a GPO change, it'll tell you where it is, the domain, it's been modified. Unfortunately, the event data doesn't tell you what it's been modified. So I'm not able to really run reports or track, what's going on with the GPO change. And the other thing that's worth noting is that you generate a change event every single item that gets checked or unchecked in there. So I actually have some suppression in there. So whatnot, I can basically effectively tell you what's been changed or that a policy has been modified, but I can't really tell you what was changed, if that makes sense. So I'll close that out there. This is actually one. So suspicious user locations. I've really moved in that kind of direction. I want to demonstrate a few things associated with this, but one of the things that the bad guys like to do when they're attacking your environments is they can, once they gain access to a system, even if they're not an administrator, they can make themselves an administrator. Matter of fact, if you read my security primer, I talk a little bit about my cybersecurity 101 series that I wrote about a month ago. A lot of what they like to do is run things out of locations, and so I've really started looking for PowerShell or executables, those batch files, those types of things, running out of spaces that any user can write to, right? Because that's effectively what they can do. Once they gain access to your system, there's literally a million different ways that they can elevate themselves to administrative rights. Because once they're sitting on your machine, right, they've got effectively, they don't have command and control yet, but they have the ability to give themselves command and control by exploiting something that's on the machine. The attack surface on the machine is going to be significantly higher than that when you're not on the machine, right? So they will start operating out of user writable locations effectively, where they can drop their malware and run their scripts and effectively give themselves command and control of the machine. Once they have that, they can harvest your credentials and whatnot. So I've started looking for basically any kind of executable that's being run out of this location. This issue right here you're seeing is a little bit of a bug, and you can kind of see why. It's actually running an executable out of your .NET framework, which is normal behavior, but it's my SCOM data reader account is actually running some command line that actually calls it, and it all shows up in the same parameter, which is why it's a bit of a bug. So I've actually corrected this in the next version, but you can kind of see what's going on. But I'm not just, in this particular case, I'm actually targeting the user's directory with this particular rule. So it's just kind of keeping an eye on in an ideal world, what kind of executables are being run out of your user's directory. So in theory, if I drop an executable on my desktop and I run it, this would flag an alert. So this is going to generate some noise to some extent because people do it. I know I am guilty of that myself. It starts kind of getting some where, but it's also something I should say in theory shouldn't really be happening all that often, right? If I'm just running, SCOM, for instance, that's running an executable, but that executable doesn't sit in a user writable location. It sits in program files, Microsoft System Center, so on and so forth. So that won't flag that alert. So you can kind of see that. I'll flag you to show you some of the closed alerts recently of stuff that I've been kind of messing. So PowerShell running only in memory, right? This one I got to track down because I'm actually getting some and actually you can see this is going to double alert because execution policy is set to bypass as well, and whatnot. Now that's not sure what this script is, but this is something that I've seen, and I don't know if this is some sort of Azure maintenance thing that's going on that I need to deal with or whatnot. But this is something that typically doesn't show up very often, but since it's popping into my lab, I have to kind of look at it a little bit closer to get the idea of some of the things I'm kind of messing with. Script run natively to bypass executable policy. This is I'm fairly confident this is something that Azure was doing. Or no, sorry, this is on my CA server. Not 100% sure what that was either, but you kind of get the idea. Is like part of what I do is I put these in my lab and I kind of let them bake just to see what see what's there, just to see get an idea of what would be normal day-to-day operations. Now my lab is fairly small. I don't have this. I don't have Exchange. I don't have SharePoint. I don't have a full productivity setup. Part of that is my company only gives me so much money to put stuff in Azure, so so I have to keep it somewhat limited. But if not, I would have our entire stack in there, so that I can kind of see some of that. So from just a kind of sidebar from a user feedback standpoint, this is the stuff where the more feedback I get, the better. It's like, hey, SCCM does this. Hey, SharePoint does this, right? So we can figure out how to kind of to write some exceptions in there so that we're not generating alerts off of that. This WMI persistence thing that we talked about, this is actually something I did. So you can kind of see what it is. I called it evil.exe or whatever it is. It's something that I literally wrote, just some command line that sits in memory. And this, because I did this, it's very persistent. It tries to run it periodically. And but it's also one of those things that you just don't see a whole lot of people doing. So, that type of thing. So those are some of the ones that have just popped in. I kind of wanted to show you some of the alerts that you're seeing, that I'm seeing kind of working through, but I do want to show you a few features in here. So let's switch to discovered inventory. This is something new here, but I've actually written a class to discover the PDC emulator, mainly because I've added an account lockout report and I want to target it at that. But let me show you something really cool I did, not in this most recent event release, but in the not this year, but in 2019, whatnot. So I've got this turned on. So I've actually got a discovery in here, and I've only got it running against my SCOM server, but that basically has inventoried all of the user writable locations that are sitting inside of the Windows directory, program files, and so on and so forth. There's also an override where you can actually add additional drive letters to it too, so you can run it against the D drive if you got SQL sitting on D or whatnot.
That's really cool. Yeah.
So I've inventoried all of this. So for those of you who are familiar with Aaron Margosis's app locker's work he calls it Aaron Locker. This was his discovery script. I reached out to him when this was also a Ready thing that I was at, only this was a couple of years ago. And Aaron was, at least while I was on the cyber team, we were on the same team, so a little bit of a working relationship. But reached out to him about can I borrow the scripts, because he basically inventories all of that and sets app locker rules against it. And at the end of the day, I would highly recommend to do it that way, because you can actually lock these directories down. But what I did is I inventoried them, and now I have rules running against those classes or those objects in the class that basically says if there's an executable running out of this directory, generate an alert. Now that has to be turned on. That is off by default. And I'll show you what you need to do. All you need to do is create a register key.
Nice and easy.
Yes. So the discovery runs, and let's see if I can remember where. Yeah, SCOM Security Monitoring MP, and then literally just create this discover user writable locations. You don't need it. Just create the folder. And as soon as you create that folder, whenever the next discovery runs, it'll actually trigger it and run the discovery and populate those. So you would have to run this on all, any server that you want this kind of tracking on in your environment. I've got some generic stuff that hits all the default ones that we know exist, right? They aren't going anywhere. But if you want the actual full list, you'd have to create that. But that can be done via group policy, right? You can literally create these register keys via group policy, and boom.
Manageable problem.
So kind of a neat thing, but you got to turn that on. Another thing that I built into it is just kind of I realized as I was doing this over time, is that there's certain audit stuff that has to be turned on in order for this to catch. Like a lot of this auditing that I'm targeting isn't necessarily on by default. So I created a distributed application, and this is really clunky, but it works. So that was a real pain to do. I'm going to actually unscope this so you can kind of see what we're looking at. And so you can see that I'm looking at, directory services change, process auditing, and whatnot. Now I went ahead and turned this off so you can see what happens. And this doesn't generate an alert, okay? So this just creates a yellow in the distributed app. But you can see what's off and not working properly. In this case, command line process auditing. And, I'll back up and show you what I'm talking about, because I actually turned this off for this demo. So that enables this particular line in the event, okay, which is where I'm targeting all these 4688 events. So if that's not there, none of these will ever fire, because that parameter doesn't exist if you haven't flagged that key.
Makes sense.
So the distributed app effectively is based off of, so here's the GPO. You can see that I turn that on. And so I'm going to go ahead and enable it and turn that back on, and it'll eventually clear up. But the idea behind that was to basically show you where it is that you may not be getting the right kind of audit data. Or you know what I mean, in order to actually fully utilize the tools that are available for you. And as you can see, by the way, I changed GPO, and hey, look at that. It's near real time. That's the part I really like about it is this tells you what's going on in real time. So now, you know, GPO changes obviously, or I would consider that an operational event. It's going to be somewhat normal. And then if you're doing it constantly every day, then maybe this isn't really a very useful rule. But you know, I find in most environments, changing GPOs is not something that's going to happen.
Yeah, it falls into the kind of set it and forget it kind of category rather than every day. Yeah,
so,
indeed.
So you can see that my GPO was modified and whatnot. I wish I could take credit for this. I did not write that rule. I stole it from somebody else. Although I have modified it quite a bit since then. So to be fair, so I have contributed to it. But yeah. So I think that at least you can kind of get an idea. Oh, I was going to show you reports. So this is
yes, that would be very cool to see too. Yeah.
Really quick. So security monitoring and TLM version 1 connection report, I believe. So let's set the date here to just January 1st. There should be some data in there. I tested this, so there better be something in here.
We always have the same issue when we're demoing stuff. Is there any demo data in my lab?
Yep. Yeah. I did test this last week, so there was data in this report. So
okay. That's all good then.
Yeah. So you can run the reports, and you should see my SCOM server and my domain controller if I remember right.
While this is loading, there are actually a few questions in the chat window.
Sure, go for it. I can't see them, so yeah.
That's okay. Oh, I've just, as soon as I clicked on it, it's disappeared. So the first question was, so you mentioned a tool that can be used for password swapping. What was the name of that tool?
I mentioned the tool. The name of that tool is called Mimikatz. That is a hacking tool. It is up on GitHub if you wanted to download it and play with it. Unfortunately, I can't. It's just a company policy. We're no longer allowed to show you how it works. Albeit if you look at the oh, it's my SQL server. But there you go. You can see it's my SQL server is doing all the NTLM v1, right? 36,000 times actually over the last.
Just a bit.
So yeah, I can't demonstrate how it works, but I'll be very honest with you. If you read through some of my blog articles where I've done pass the hash work, you'll see screenshots from it if you really want. But yeah, the name of the tool is Mimikatz. But yes, that is a hacking tool. You check your corporate policies and all that kind of stuff, because it's one of those things that if your security guys detect it on your system, you could find yourself in a whole load of hot water.
Yeah, understandably, given what
true story. I had downloaded it, was playing around with it. Actually, I was trying to recompile it just so that I could hide the signature enough. I was trying to recompile it in Visual Studio to see if I could give it enough of a different signature that I didn't have to turn off Defender in my lab to play with it. And my Defender picked it up when I did that on my corporate laptop. I had somebody from Microsoft Security messaging me within about 60 seconds.
That's awesome.
We just found Mimikatz on your computer. Yeah, it's legit. I just showed them what I was doing. It was not the end of the world. But do understand that some people wouldn't take that, would not necessarily appreciate that. So just be careful.
Yeah, completely understandably. Perfect. Well, I'll go through the questions quickly while we're doing that. So the next one is, my organization is looking into using Azure Sentinel. Would the security monitoring MP complement this, or should I focus my efforts somewhere else?
So I have, if I could ever get around to learning Custo, I would actually like to write a lot of this stuff in Sentinel and have some sort of Sentinel-based add-on that could do that. That also requires learning something else altogether. I don't know enough about Sentinel to know what checks they have in place. My gut feel is that this is going to complement it. Sentinel is definitely if you're familiar with tools like Splunk or something like that, it's our answer to that. So if you kind of look at what your capabilities of, say, Splunk are, that's kind of what your capabilities of Sentinel are. I haven't seen a Splunk guy actually showing me this kind of stuff, to be very honest with you. I mean, I'm going through the attack MITRE stuff. I'm looking at, those sites, and I'm looking at actual credible things that somebody might be doing and seeing what I can detect and what I can't. Typically, those are going to be used more for the log aggregation components that tools like SCOM fall massively short in. So, it can look at, Sentinel or Splunk or ATA or any of these tools can really look at it and go, why did this user sign on 1,000 times to 900 different computers in a 10-minute window, right? It can see stuff like that SCOM can't see. So I would say there's definitely some there's complementary values to it. Splunk will probably do a better job telling you where your NTLM v1 is than I would, right? That kind of stuff. It just depends on what you feed it. But you do understand that part of these tools is just putting the tool in is only a part of the battle. You're going to still have to tell it what to look for. Now, obviously with Sentinel, we've got a lot of security related things in there, but I'm not on that team and my customers don't use it. So I'm not really an expert on it. So I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but that's kind of
that's perfect. That's perfect. There's one question I'm going to save for in a minute, and you'll see why when I get to it. So Jan or Jan, your question I will come back to. I'm not deliberately skipping it. The other question I was going to address now is, will you send out a link to the recording so I can share it with my SecOps team? Yes, we will. We'll get the recording sent out afterwards. Awesome. So thank you very much for the demo. If I just switch back to my screen, I'm going to skip over some slides because we have 2 minutes left.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. And just wanted to say, if you haven't already, then if you go to Nathan Gau's blog, which is at this address, I've created a nice little bit.ly for you. You can download the Security Monitoring Management Pack, and it's a free download. Somewhere in the background, I have it. It looks a bit like this. So do go and get it. And the final point I wanted to make was that, Nathan, as you've said a few times, you're looking for feedback in terms of how do you extend, build on what you've already built with the Security Monitoring MP, which leads nicely on to Jan, your question, which is, have you ever thought about supporting sysmon logs for extended functionality? It's a perfect potential piece of feedback for the next feature.
I will say that Wei Lim and I had talked about writing SCOM actually has sysmon capabilities built into it, but the APIs aren't exposed to the OS. And that is something that Wei and I were talking about trying to write, but because he's done stuff like that with PowerShell and whatnot, and it would just be a matter of really just it's a level of skill that I don't have to actually expose that. But we talked about it. That's about as far as it went, though, to be very honest.
It's on the radar. That's okay. Well, the main thing from your perspective is, you want to get feedback on what to include in the next version. So if there are feature requests from anyone in the audience, here are all the many ways you can get in contact with Nathan. So throughout this whole webinar, we've had Slack up and running. We'll have a look at questions there in a minute at the end if we have time. If not, we can address them. Although I don't know how much use I'll be in addressing those questions after the webinar's over.
LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach me, just an FYI. I get a lot of email. I don't always see it. So
yeah, understood. The joys of working for a large company. So that's that. And so I guess all that's left to say is, so what's next for you, Nathan?
So yeah, I'm glad you kept this slide up here. So this is the cybersecurity basics is a 4-part series I wrote, talking about kind of the basics of cyber and where organizations are falling short. I will tell you, just in my experience in the cyber team in a couple of years, I see a lot of designing around specific exploits, which is really not a good way to handle it. You can design around pass a hash. But at the end of the day, if I eliminate pass a hash as an exploit, and I haven't taken care of the underlying vulnerability, which is exposed credentials, right? The attacker's got another way to get at your exposed credentials. So I wrote that series. It's not written for cyber people. It's written by a cyber person for the average IT person. So they can kind of get a better idea as to what it is that their organization is doing that is exposing them to risk. And if I were to sum it up, obviously, administrators are not restricted in most organizations, and so they're not using privileged access workstations. They're doing administration from their standard productivity desktop. They've also got too many of them, right? So it's like, oh, we're just gonna make you a DA. It makes it easy, right? And they're not controlling where they're accessing it from, and nor are they controlling the number of administrators they have in the environment. Simple things like that. So I kind of walk through just kind of the basics of things that you and your org can do that can really simple thing. Well, I was going to say simple. Some of it's projects, but it's stuff that you and your org can do to really minimize some of your risks and get the bad guys to start looking elsewhere when they find that they cannot easily laterally move through your environment. Because you've put in some basic security protocols in place to prevent them from doing that. Highly recommend the read. It's one of my more recent articles. I think I wrote it last month. So
I remember talking about it on the run up to SCOMathon. Yeah, and as you say, so if I was going to, personally speaking, start tackling security, I would not know where to start. I'm relatively technical. I've got an IT background, got an engineering background, but where to begin? Some of that stuff, as you say.
I give you a great starting point. Okay, yeah, I'll be very honest with you. If you contracted Microsoft to come out, this is probably some of this. This is all stuff. This is like the first thing they're going to tell you to do.
Yeah, so, and it makes sense. Don't have too many administrators. Really, really simple thing that you could do that's practical. Right. That doesn't involve expensive tooling or anything.
Right. Exactly. They have too many administrators, and we're not controlling where they use them. Right. We can lock them down so that they're only using their administrative from a dedicated administrative workstation that doesn't have internet, that's hardened, that doesn't have productivity apps, which means that the bad guy can't actually laterally move into an administrative environment. They can move all through your tier 2 environment all day long. Well, and we can restrict that to a large extent too, which I talk about in there. But the point being is they can't get to the machines where the actual administrative credentials are running, so they can't scrape them. And so now they're forced, if they really want your environment, to start trying to brute force them, which is very detectable. But even if they're brute forcing them, if you're restricting to where they can go from, they have to be in that right IP range, and without that kind of thing. So just some really basic things you can do, not terribly expensive, but can really make it. I shouldn't say not terrible. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that a typical IT budget would do. We're not talking about buying new tools or anything fancy like that. We're just talking about using what you have to really enforce proper usage and whatnot. So
perfect. And of course, the next version of the security monitoring MP, which is where Nathan needs your feedback. So I'll just quickly look in the chat window, see if there's any other questions.
Targeting next May for that. I always do that around May. So I got the more feedback I can get, the better. So if
more time to work on
something that's really noisy and you know why it's noisy, it's usually easy to clean up. If you got an idea for a feature you'd like to see, I may or may not be able to do it. It depends on the ask, but I certainly will hear you out. How's that sound? So
sounds good to me. You can but ask. So any of them, I think, more comment than question is, as a service provider, we host about 4,000 servers in 100 domains, so it's not easy to roll out security. That sounds like genuine hell, to be honest.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you have SCOM and you have agents on all of those servers, you've already traversed a bunch of that fun, which will certainly help with the infrastructure side of things. So your point is still entirely valid.
Well, I do have a series on hardening SCOM, and I highly suggest you read that if you're doing that.
Yeah. I can understand why. The whole you can run executables from SCOM agents piece scares the living daylight out of me. So that's all we have time for. So thank you, everybody who is attending today, for coming. Thank you, Nathan, for being our guest today. If there are any other questions, we'll head over to Slack now and take them on Slack. Thank you very much.